welcome to the panel. So the title is Rescuing the Sembène Archive. I think it's very appropriate that we are having this after the previous two panels, actually, because in fact, Sembène was a living witness, actor, agent of each of these periods. Yeah, Sembène obviously was born in the colonial period, and so was part, in fact, consumed this colonial archive in many ways as part of growing up as a colonial subject in Senegal. He obviously was also an actor in the decolonization process, being in France in particular from 1947 to 1960 roughly, where of course he started working as a writer, attended some of the most important events in the, let's say, intellectual and cultural decolonization of the continent. I'm thinking of the famous Présence Africaine conferences of 56 and 59. And of course, he decided to return home, let's say, at the dawn of independence to participate cinematically to precisely that nation building project. And was obviously also part and parcel of this Cold War dynamics, having been trained in the Soviet Union, first even going there first as a writer and then returning as a film student this time, and probably many more times in Tashkent, for example, to show his films. And so, and of course, having lived through the transformation of this continent until the era of globalization. So he's a figure who really, really threads through all the different periods, the different moments that we've been talking about so far. Now, and then obviously, I don't think he really needs introduction, but obviously, in terms of his significance, we know that he's, of course, one of the both literal and figurative monuments of African cinema. Yeah, and so given that our work is about the archive, it was essential that we also feature such a figure who is both himself an archive of African history, an archive of African cinema, an archive of even world cinema in some ways, and of course through his own work that also now constitute the archive of what we understand as African cinema, and even in terms of, let's say, laying out both a political, ideological, aesthetic project, so to speak, for the cinema of that continent. And so, hence the title, Father of African Cinema. And so he's so central to the emergence, the existence of African cinema, to the identity of African cinema, to even the project, the legacy of African cinema. And so his place in this discussion is obviously central, not the least of which reason is, of course, that the notion of historical conscience and consciousness was always central also to his work, and that he was battling against amnesia and erasure, the erasure of Africa from both micro and macro narratives of the world. And in that sense, he also touches on some of the discussions that we're having here. He himself, in some ways, constituted archives, if you will, that were of stories that had not really made it profoundly into the historical narrative. One could think about, for example, the Kandre Charoy, so to speak, at least not predominant. So his films and novels constitute an archive of the transformation of the continent from independence to globalization, so to speak. And he was, of course, one of the best observers of such transformation or lack of transformation, depending on how one wants to see it. So he's therefore one of the figures through whom it's possible to read the times, even as he himself, to a large extent, and he liked to say that the artist has to have his fingers on the pulse of his time. And I think it is fair to say that he was very much such an artist. And so Sembène passed away in 2007. So it's been a while now. And so the question of also the legacy that he left behind, he left us a broad legacy of films, of novels, of papers, and even artwork, etc., that he left behind, that demand, that asked of it, that we interrogated, that we revisited in particular, precisely to really reconnect it to the kind of conversation that we are trying to have as part of Reframing Africa in terms of thinking the archival from Africa and let's say in relation to Africa. And so it's my great pleasure, our great pleasure, to really receive Samba Gadjigo today, to really go through many aspects of this. And so we would like to ask Samba, therefore, first to give us a sense of broadly, before entering into the detail about the physical dimensions of the Sembène archive, what does he think is, let's say, the significance of Sembène itself as an archive of a particular project, of a particular project? Yeah. And yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Aboubakar, and the whole team out there. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be invited here to talk about Ousmane Sembène's archive. Actually, I love the title, Rescuing the Sembène Archive. I was just saying to myself yesterday, I think we should not be talking about the rescuing, but the rescued Sembène archive. So along that kind line of thinking, if I may, Aboubakar and the others, is just to present very briefly the rescued archive, what we have right now and where it is. And then I'll give the highlights of the rescuing, meaning the process of getting them from Lekgetho in Dakar to where they are right now. So it's very, again, this is, I would like this to be on a mode of conversation and also just exchanging ideas and the thoughts. It's still, you will understand, it is still very raw for me to talk about the role I played personally in rescuing this archive, because fortunately, since 1989, when I first met Sembène in person, I would say maybe our biographies have been intertwined. I've been very much involved with him at a personal level, like father-son relationship, or scholar to author relationship, and so on and so forth. So it's still very difficult to talk about, but I will try my best. First, as I said, I would like to talk, Aboubakar, about the rescued material as it is right now. For your information, the Sembène archive, as we speak, is now at the Lilly Library at the Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States. Just even mentioning where it is right now, it gives me some pinching in my heart, and you will understand why, I hope, later. It is at the Lilly Library. They arrived there about 3 years ago in 29 boxes. 29 boxes of material, which correspond to about 50 feet of material. The title of the collection is Sembène Ousmane Manuscript, 1956 to 2007, meaning then it dates from the publication of his first novel in 1956 to the year he died in 2007, meaning then it's about a little bit over 50 years of memory, if you will. The collection number is, just for those of you who are curious to try to find it later, is L as in Louisiana, M as in mountain, C as in Congo, LMC 2943. So that's where the archive, actually after our conversation, if you want to look at it, you can go online and see the entire thing. I have here on paper, of course, I cannot show it, it's not very convenient. So that is rescued. The content here is, for the content, I'll just again here summarize what is in the archival document here. As I said, it is about 50 feet. It includes published as well as unpublished manuscripts, film scripts, hundreds of leaves of correspondence, notebooks, photographs, and so on and so forth. Boubacar, you asked me to talk about the significance of Sembène. And to do that, I think I'll just summarize how the archive presented it. Ousmane Sembène's archive documents not only the life and the career of Ousmane Sembène, the novelist, but in a larger sense, the genesis of African film. Voluminous correspondence, manuscripts, etc., date back to the late 50s, recording Sembène's creative. I hear a lot of background noise. So dating from the late 50s, it records Ousmane Sembène's creative development on a personal level first, namely his transition into filmmaker, alongside the broader experience of writing and directing in Africa. His correspondence charts his numerous projects, his relationship with other filmmakers, as well as with politicians and officials at home and abroad. The archive also illustrates the issues of censorship and banning, the day-to-day process of production and distribution, the level of personal relationship, the travels, and much more. There are also notes and drafts that are present and which give us an insight into his major accomplished work, as well as projects he has never realized when he was alive. Very briefly, different categories in the content. You have the films. As of now at Indiana, if you go to do the research, you have insight into all his films, going from Brom Saret, 1963, Nyai, 64, to Molade, 2004. Those are the films that Sembène has directed when he was alive. But then he had a lot of other projects that never materialized. Those are Momen, which was already ready in 1964. Samuri, I'm here. All of you who know about Sembène's work, who know about Sembène, you know how significant that film project has been for him, and he worked on it for 35 years. That's Samuri. Then Guts Bits of Wood, what many people did not know was that Sembène himself had already prepared to transform it into a film, which has never happened. But for your information right now, it is the Danny Glover, the African-American director, who has the right to Guts Bits of Wood for making a feature film. Then there is another film that has never got made. The title is Maudo, which is an adaptation of a novel titled The Last of the Empire. So those are the, of course, there is also one dating back to the mid-80s. The title is Jib, J-I-I-B. So that all those give you, documents, correspondence, so on. His struggles trying to make a summary. It's all collected there. And then you have the novels, short stories, poetry, nonfiction, and what the archive labels as related material. For the novels, you have Docker Noir. Aboubakar talked about it, which is his first novel. You have L'Harmattan, 1964. Khala, the short story, 1973. Le Dernier de l'Empire, 1981. So those are the published novels whose traces you can find at Indiana. Of course, it does not represent all his literary work. And then the unpublished novel we found that's really very, very, I had never heard about it, It's Tukhmi. Tukhmi is the title in Wolof. Tukh means to smoke. Then, then you have Kadu. Kadu is the first Wolof literary journal. Well, actually, let's say just the journal that Sembène created with others in 1972. When we talk about Sembène, of course, we talk about Sembène, mostly about Sembène, the filmmaker, and then the Sembène, the novelist or the short story writer. But what we don't know, and which you'll find a wealth of it at Indiana, is the poems that Sembène wrote. He wrote poems, never published them, except one, which dates back to even before Le Docker Noir, but the same year, 1956, a poem he published titled Liberté, Liberty. Then you have many essays and articles which have not been published. Then, of course, third category, meaning the correspondence, is also there, dating back, as we said, from 1956 to the year he died in 2007. Notebooks and diaries, photographs and ephemera. We found over 2,000 photographs in Sembène's albums. I mean, which really gives a visual testimony to the people he has met around the world, not only in Senegal, in Africa, I mean, in all categories of life. And then what they title here, of course, as printed material. So if you will, that is really the content and the significance of this archive. Now, that we have talked about the rescued material, I would like to talk about the rescuing itself, the operation itself. That's where really I become very emotional, because it has been a very, very, very difficult, but it's in one single day, I would go from being totally happy, exhilarated, to being completely depressed by the process. But just I'll try to walk you through how that went. Truth be told, the issue of keeping Sembène's memory, archive, and work actually came up even before Sembène died. When I started going to his house in 1989, already I had noticed something Sembène was doing which was heartbreaking, which means burning some of his manuscripts, his drafts. I became very, very worried about that, because of course I had assigned myself the work of keeping Sembène's memory, and I was witnessing the voluntary destruction of the traces of that memory. So I've been trying in our conversations in a very subtle way to make him aware of the necessity to keep those traces. So the process started 2 years before Sembène passed. They started in 2005. Still, memory is still fresh in my mind. We were at Yale University and we had presented his latest film, Molade. And then a colleague at Yale, Dudley Andrew, maybe some of you know, approached Sembène. So what about Mr. Sembène, what about giving us the honor to house your papers here at Yale? Well, Sembène turned to him and said, well, write to Samba and then we'll talk about it later. So I have the first email that Dudley Andrew wrote to Sembène in 2005 after the screening of Molade at Yale, asking exactly, Sembène, what I summarized for you. I read, translated for Sembène, and Sembène asked me, tell him I am for the idea. I agree with the idea in principle. I don't know when and how it is going to happen, but I have one precondition. Whoever acquires my papers has to put in writing and signed that a copy will be made available to the African continent. Once we agree on that, every other things are subject to negotiation. So the process started even before Sembène died. Sembène died in June 9th, 2007. Actually, coincidence. I was on a plane from New York to Dakar to go see Sembène because I knew from his housekeeper that he was in his final days. So he died in 2007. Of course, all the document, everything was in his house in two parts. One in his study in what we call maybe the basement or the first floor. And then the rest of it was in his bedroom. So he had two working spaces. His bedroom, where he has a lot of books archived, and then in his official office. So all of Sembène's memory was in that very enclosed space. Maybe some of you may not know, but Aboubakar knows the location of Lekgetho, sitting there right on the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, literally you have your feet in water. It is a house that Sembène built with his own hands in 1967, right a year after the premiere of Black Girl. But anyway, so the archive was there from 2007 to 2011, meaning 4 years, locked up in that space with no ventilation. I mean, with all the insect and so on and so forth, and water, rain. So 4 years later, I decided, I mean, I did not know what the condition was after those 4 years, but I decided to do something about it. But where to start, I don't know. So I talked to his Sembène's estate, meaning his children, who, there are 3 of them, and who agreed with the presence of their lawyers to go to Lekgetho and to open those 2 spaces. So we opened the study and we opened the bedroom. I mean, my documentary gives you a glimpse of the chaos that was in the house, but I cannot tell you, I cannot drive home the feelings I had to see Sembène's life and life's work littered, literally, on the ground. So we did that, looked at it, and then, of course, the second step, well, now we have seen the condition in which the documents are, what to do about it. Certainly, and that's where I think your title comes in, we need a rescue mission, literally rescue mission, because the danger was there, it was palpable, it was visible. The Senegalese government, nobody, after all the celebration, after all the trumpeting and the drums went down, just, it was the beginning of a total process of erasure, literally, and Aboubakar used the word. So I had to have permission to do something about it. So I got that permission. They told me, now on, we entrust you with the rescue. I knew already that there were some legal issues because in Senegalese laws, when it comes to, they have 2 categories. You have the public papers, administration, and so on and so forth, and then you have the private papers. Of course, I did not deal with the public aspect, but just the private. I was made to understand that, yes, it is private, but Senegal has the first right to these papers, meaning if they are going to be sold privately, that it is the state first that has to say yes or no. That took almost 3 years. But I started the process. Of course, I decided also to explore other issues, other areas where to put it if the opportunity arises. Well, there were 3 universities, well, there were 2 initial universities interested in 2011 to 2012. First was Columbia University. I contacted the librarian of the African Studies at Columbia and just talked about it. Oh yes, very much interested. Now, Colombia were the first, but very, very quickly they shied away from the project because it is archive material coming from abroad. And they had had previous issues with that kind of document. So very easily they came out of the picture. Then, of course, Yale came up. Well, with Yale, the problem was also that they knew about the exit visa issue. And that is something I could not solve in Senegal. I had realized.
Samba,
yes.
sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. It appears that we actually have less time than I thought we have.
Mm-hmm.
We don't actually have a full hour. Okay. So if you could maybe wrap up that part and then we can sort of enter into the exchange with the audience.
I'm done actually. Good,
okay.
Good point. So anyway, so that took from the process study took from 2011 to 2019. The papers arrived at Indiana in 2019, or in 2020. As I said, you can go to their website, you will see all the material there. There are other issues I would like to deal with, but I hope those are going to come up in the question answers, ethical issues, political issues, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Samba. Evidently, there's a lot to talk about in terms of, say, Sembène and the sound archive, Sembène, obviously the literary archive, Sembène in terms of film. So far, the discussion has focused mainly on the literary aspect of Sembène. One of our participants, Rosemary Nayoli, poses this particular question, which raises both ethical and moral questions. She says, why preserve Sembène archives in Lilly Library in Indiana, US, and not in Africa, the origin of its being, of its becoming, if you like? And you've somewhat touched on some of those issues, but maybe you can also delve a little bit deeper in terms of questions of ownership and access and those kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, yes, I think that's the question that has been, still sometimes it tortures me to tell you the truth. Because yes, Sembène, Senegalese, Sembène Pan-Africanist who fought all his life to kind of galvanize the African people, to put a mirror in front of them, to be the educator, to use his art as a political instrument, as he puts it. Why, after his death, take Sembène's papers outside? That has been a question that tortured, but as I told you initially, Sembène had already given me at least what I considered a pointer by telling Dudley Andrew at Yale, I'm open to the idea of having my archive come to Yale, meaning go abroad, but a copy should be made and left to Africans. I think he had already given me the pointers. And besides, the question was, yes, very, very difficult, but also very easy at the same time, because I can give you a list of all artists, writers, Senegalese, Birago Diop, Senghor, who died and left no trace in Senegal. Their papers just vanished. The administration was not interested. So for me, the choice was between a total erasure of Sembène's memory and finding a compromise whereby I could have them materially rescued, conserved, digitized, and made available to not only Senegal, but the rest of the world. And quite frankly, if I had to do it again, I would repeat it without hesitation. Without hesitation, because yes, if I had followed, it's not really an easy issue. And this is, again, for the first time I talk about it in public. It is not very, very easy, but I think let me tell you about the condition of the National Archive in Senegal today. Almost inexistent. Almost inexistent. The condition of conservation are horrible. So to answer your question, why Sembène's archive at the Lilly Library? For me, it was a choice of finding a workable compromise and letting Sembène's documents completely disappear.
Could you maybe address what steps are being taken at Indiana University to digitize these literary scripts and manuscripts and all these documents that they now have in their possession? Because over a period of time, as you know, these documents can easily deteriorate and get damaged. So I'm kind of interested in knowing what steps are being taken to digitize this. Was it like 29 boxes of materials?
Well, actually, that process is well underway, and I'm not giving Indiana excuses, but I think it were not because of the COVID. I would have said right now it would have been almost completed, because I visited the Lilly Library about a year ago. The cataloging is already complete, it's already there. So since we don't have much time, and to just give you in a nutshell, it has already been cataloged. The digitization is going on, and here is a contract, and a copy is going to be made and sent to Senegal.
Question. I want to put in a question very quickly.
Yes.
Just to return precisely to this issue of Indiana, and I'm wondering if, because obviously part of even the Reframing Africa project and some of the discussions that we've had since this morning have to also perhaps do with some form of, I don't know, we talked about repatriation, we talked about, I think, or for me personally, as part of other work that I'm doing within FEPASI and so on, the question of building archival infrastructure precisely so that such migration, unfortunate for political purposes, but I wouldn't say, but let's say, compromissory for preservational purposes, if I could call it so. If let's say if you are not opening a can of worms in some ways. In other words, the idea of having the papers of African artists, intellectuals, filmmakers, in our case, since that is our focus, start to migrate outside of the continent. Now that, let's say, Sembène has opened the way, since he was such an ideological force in terms of actualizing a certain sense of African pride, African sovereignty, and so on, including in the domain of the archive. I'm wondering if by deciding, I wonder if, let's say, that exchange with Dudley was sufficient to take it away. In other words, whether other possibilities could not have been imagined. For example, since Indiana University has the means to bring them all to purchase them, and to bring them all the way to Indiana and save them, could they not precisely, let's say, even if we want to play the developmentalist card here, could they not have turned Lekgetho or another space in Dakar or anywhere on these other 53 countries, 55 countries on the continent, set up something that would, of course, that would be, for we, the continent would be extremely grateful precisely for enabling the patrimony of Sembène to remain in Africa, because we cannot imagine in their case the Constitution of the US being in Joburg or in Accra, for example, or the Declaration of Independence, which are so fundamentally part of the identity formation of these countries. And these archives are, because Sembène is part of the construction of African identity through his own personal life, through his work, through his cinema. And so what do you have to say about that? In other words, the possibility of really, instead of keeping on just shocked because they have the means and therefore there's a kind of, almost I feel like Jibril Job Mambeti and Linguère Ramatu type of figure here, right? So that you almost waiting till the person has no clothes on their body before you really literally take. So I'm wondering if there's something, some reflection, in other words, obviously we're happy that it's there, that's been digitized, etc. But if some other forms of reflection can also take place in a parallel manner, whereby obviously our states have to be beaten up more, African states have to be beaten up a little more so that that thing can happen. There's a lot of work to do on the continent. This is also the proof that we have a lot of work to do ourselves. That's clear. But if other ways of thinking about this could have been possible.
Yeah, could you just be brief because we're running out of time? So try to
certainly that kind of thinking should have been possible. It was even possible, and we had that kind of conversation mostly with Colombia. And what Colombia basically told me is, you summed it up. We're interested in Sembène. We're not interested in investing money to build a cultural infrastructure in Africa. Basically, that's what it is. And as they say in French, avec des si on peut mettre Paris dans une bouteille vis. If you could put Paris into a bottle, meaning yes, a lot of scenario, other possibilities could have been opened. But again, not to justify, I told you from the beginning, the process I went through, how I did it, if I had to repeat it, I would do exactly the same thing, maybe with new insight and so on and so forth. For me, it was a race against time. For me, it was a race. I could not wait for the Senegalese government to understand that Sembène is important while the mice are sitting there and eating the papers. So again, it is not the ideal situation, but I worked with what I had. And as I told you from my preamble, it gives me pinches in my heart. But sometimes I look at myself in a mirror, I say to myself, you did the right thing.
Just very briefly, Samba, could you speak to what's happening to the other elements of the Sembène archive, the films, the song archives, and so on and so forth? Do you have any information about that body of work?
Yeah, there is a whole as you know, there is a whole restoration effort that is going on now for Sembène's film, and actually Aboubakar is very active in that process. There are also already Black Girl and the Borom Saret have been restored, and as we speak, the restoration of Mandabi is going on. Both Aboubakar and I are working on that, and there is a project to rescue more of its films. Another thing that is being done also is Sembène across Africa. I mean, this is, as I told you, in less than a week, we have already more than 700,000 people that's going on. And of course, bringing again the conversation to framing Africa, and it broadens the scope of conversation about Ousmane Sembène. So there is a lot of work being done. And I know in the US, there are foundations that are ready to contribute in transforming Lekgetho into a cultural space.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. I guess we have to wrap it up here. So
okay, great. Well, listen, thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity. If I can bring more to the conversation, I would be more than happy to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
So this clearly opens up a lot of discussions about, I think one of the threads that we could have for the rest is actually the question of the papers of African filmmakers more generally in South Africa and other places. But we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.